I thought I was over him, but my body didn't get the memo, because the moment Lucas Hayes stepped back into my life, 3 years, 2 months, and 11 days since the last time I swore I'd forget him, everything inside me betrayed me at once. It started with something stupid, something small, just his hand brushing mine as he reached past me for a file, barely a second, barely skin against skin, but my breath caught like I'd just run a mile, my fingers tingled, my heart skipped so hard it actually hurt, and I froze, completely froze, like my body remembered a language I had spent years trying to unlearn. I pulled my hand back too fast, knocking my coffee cup slightly, forcing out a laugh that sounded wrong even to me. Too sharp, too fake, while my pulse hammered in my ears, and I told myself it meant nothing, absolutely nothing, just a reflex, just muscle memory, just coincidence, except it wasn't. Because he didn't move away, not immediately, he lingered there, too close, close. Enough that I could feel the heat from him, close enough that his cologne hit me. That same clean, warm scent I used to bury my face in like it was the only place I belonged. And suddenly the office felt smaller, tighter, like the air had thickened around us. I swallowed hard, staring at the stack of papers in front of me like they could anchor me, like they could keep me grounded. But then he said my name, low, steady, like he hadn't forgotten the way it should sound when it left his lips. And that did something worse, something deeper, because my chest tightened and my stomach flipped in a way that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with memory. I stepped back again, needing space, needing distance, needing something to break whatever invisible pull had just snapped back into place between us. But he followed, just one step, not aggressive, not forcing, just enough to close the gap I tried to create. And my body reacted again, traitorous, leaning into the warmth. Before my brain could catch up and scream at me to stop. Don't, I said quickly, too quickly, my voice thinner than I wanted, and I hated that he noticed. I hated the way his eyes flickered, darkened slightly, like he was seeing right through me, like he already knew what I was trying so hard to deny. He tilted his head just a fraction, studying me, and for a second neither of us moved. The space between us charged with something unspoken, something unfinished, something that refused to stay buried no matter how much time had passed. And then he spoke again, quieter this time, closer, like the words were meant only for me. "You still do that," he murmured, and my stomach dropped, because I knew exactly what he meant, the way my breath hitched, the way my shoulders tensed, the way my body gave me away before I could control it, and I hated it. I hated that after everything. After all the nights I spent convincing myself I was fine, that I was over him, that I didn't need him anymore, all it took was one touch, one step, one word, and suddenly none of it felt true, and the worst part was standing there with his presence wrapping around me like something familiar and dangerous at the same time. I realized with a kind of quiet, terrifying clarity that maybe I hadn't been trying to forget him hard enough, or maybe, just maybe, my body had never forgotten him at all. Lucas did not step back. Not when I told him to. Not when my voice clearly meant it. And that was the problem, because a part of me had already started leaning toward him again. Like gravity had shifted, and I was no longer in control of which direction I fell. I forced myself to move first this time, grabbing the stack of folders from the desk like they were suddenly the most important thing in the world, like paperwork could somehow shield me from him. From this, from whatever had just come roaring back to life between us without permission. I walked past him, too quickly, my shoulder brushing his arm again. And this time it was worse, sharper, like a spark jumping skin to skin, and my breath hitched before I could stop it, loud enough that I knew he heard it. Of course he heard it. Lucas always noticed everything. "You are doing it again," he said behind me, calm, almost curious, and I hated how steady he sounded when I felt like I was coming apart in slow motion. I stopped a few feet away, gripping the folders tighter than necessary, the edges digging into my palms, grounding me just enough to keep my voice from shaking too badly when I turned around. "I am not doing anything," I said, but even to my own ears it sounded weak, like a lie that had not been fully formed before it left my mouth. He took another step closer, closing the distance I had just created, not rushing, not forcing, just steady, inevitable, and my body reacted again, traitorous, my shoulders tensing, my pulse climbing, my thoughts scrambling to catch up with sensations that were already miles ahead. You still hold your breath when I get close, he said quietly, like he was pointing out a fact, not asking a question, and that made something twist in my chest because he remembered. He remembered things I had tried so hard to erase, little habits, tiny reactions, pieces of me I had spent years pretending never existed. I inhaled sharply just to prove him wrong, except that only made it worse, because now I was hyper-aware of every inch between us, of the way the air felt warmer, heavier, like it was pressing in from all sides. Stop analyzing me, I snapped, finally managing to put some edge into my voice, but it came out thinner than I wanted, like frustration wrapped around something much softer, something I refused to name. Lucas's gaze did not waver. If anything, it sharpened, focused entirely on me like I was the only thing in the room worth paying attention to, and for a second it felt exactly like it used to, like being seen too clearly, too completely, like there was nowhere to hide. I am not analyzing, he said, lower now, quieter. I am remembering. And that hit harder than anything else, because I was remembering too, whether I wanted to or not, the way he used to stand this close, the way my body used to respond before my mind had time to interfere, the way everything used to feel easy, natural, inevitable, and I hated that those memories were still there, still alive under the surface, waiting for one moment like this to break through. I shook my head, stepping back again, putting actual space between us this time, forcing distance even as every instinct screamed that it felt wrong. That does not mean anything, I said quickly, almost over myself, like if I said it fast enough it might become true. People do not just forget physical habits overnight. But even as the words left my mouth I knew that was not what this was, not really, because this was not just habit, this was recognition. This was something deeper, something my body had held on to long after my mind had decided to let go. Lucas exhaled slowly, like he was considering something, like he was deciding how far to push this. And that should have made me feel safer, should have given me a chance to regain control. But instead it made my chest tighten again, because part of me did not want him to step back, did not want him to stop, and that realization was worse than anything else, because it meant the problem was not him, it was me, it was always me, standing here pretending I had moved on when all it took was a few minutes in the same room for everything to unravel. And as he took one more step forward, slow, deliberate, closing the gap just enough to make my pulse spike all over again, I realized with a sinking certainty that this was only the beginning. And I was already losing. Lucas stopped just short of touching me again, but the space between us felt thinner than ever, like one wrong breath could close it completely, and I hated how aware I was of that distance, how my eyes kept flicking to the inch of air between his hand and my arm, like I was waiting for it, like I was bracing for it, and maybe worse, like I wanted it. I shifted my weight, trying to ground myself, trying to focus on something normal, something safe, like the hum of the office lights or the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. But none of it stuck. None of it mattered. Not when he was right there, steady and quiet and entirely too close. You always do this, he said, softer now, not accusing, not even teasing, just observing. And that made it worse somehow, because it meant he was not guessing. He knew. He remembered patterns I had spent years trying to break. Do what? I asked, even though I already knew, my voice coming out lower, tighter, like it was caught somewhere between defense and something far more fragile. His gaze dropped briefly, just for a second, to my hands where I was still gripping the folders too tightly, then lifted back to my face, and that tiny shift sent a ripple through me, like he had touched me without actually making contact. You act like you want distance, he said, but you never step far enough. And my chest tightened because he was right, because even now I was only a step away, not across the room, not out the door, just close enough to feel everything I should not be feeling. I swallowed, my throat dry, and forced a small, sharp laugh that did not sound like me at all. That is called being professional, I said quickly. We work together now, remember, but the words felt thin, like they could not hold the weight of what was actually happening between us. Lucas tilted his head slightly, studying me again, and there was something different in his expression now, something quieter, something that made my pulse jump for a completely different reason. Professional, he repeated, like he was testing the word. And then he took a slow breath, his shoulders easing just a fraction, like he was deciding to shift the pace instead of pushing harder. That should have helped, should have given me space to breathe. But instead it made everything feel more deliberate, more controlled, like he was choosing exactly how close to get without crossing a line. And that restraint was somehow more unsettling than if he had just ignored it. I lowered my gaze, focusing on the edge of the desk beside me, tracing the faint scratch in the wood with my eyes. Anything to avoid looking at him again, because every time I did it felt like something in me slipped, like my control loosened just a little more. It does not matter, I said, quieter now, the edge fading despite my best efforts. Whatever this is, it does not mean anything. And I wanted to believe that. I needed to believe that. Because the alternative was admitting that after everything, after all the distance and silence and carefully built walls, he still had this effect on me without even trying. There was a pause, not long, but heavy, the kind that stretched just enough to make every second feel intentional. And then I felt it, not a touch, not quite, but close, the faint brush of movement near my sleeve as Lucas reached past me again, slower this time, careful, like he was aware of exactly what it would do. My breath caught anyway, sharp and immediate, and I hated that he heard it. I hated that I could not stop it, that my body reacted before my mind could even form a defense. His hand paused near mine, not touching, just there, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his skin, and for a second neither of us moved, the moment stretching tight, fragile, like it could snap or shift into something else entirely. Still nothing, he said quietly, almost to himself, but I heard it. Of course I did, and something in my chest twisted, because I knew he was not asking anymore. He was confirming, and the worst part was I could not prove him wrong, not when my pulse was racing, not when my fingers twitched like they remembered exactly what it felt like to fit against his. I pulled my hand back abruptly, finally breaking the moment, creating space that felt too cold too fast, like stepping out of sunlight into shade, and I shook my head, more to myself than to him, trying to reset, trying to rebuild the distance I had just lost. But as I looked up again and met his eyes, steady and knowing and far too calm, I realized he had already seen everything he needed to see, and no matter how much I tried to deny it, there was no going back to pretending this was nothing. The space between us snapped back into place the moment I pulled away, but it did not feel like relief. It felt like loss, sharp and immediate, like something had been taken from me before I even understood why I wanted it. I turned too quickly, setting the folders down on the nearest desk with more force than necessary, the sound louder than it should have been in the quiet office, and I focused on that instead, on the normalcy of it, on the idea that everything was still under control, even though my pulse had not slowed and my hands still felt unsteady. Behind me, Lucas did not follow this time, and somehow that was worse, because now I was hyper-aware of the distance again, aware that he had chosen to stop, chosen not to close the gap, and that choice lingered in the air between us like a question I did not want to answer. "You are trying too hard," he said after a moment, his voice calm, almost thoughtful, and I closed my eyes briefly, just for a second, because I knew exactly what he meant, even if I did not want to admit it. I exhaled slowly, forcing my shoulders to relax, forcing my breathing to even out, and when I turned back around, I kept my expression neutral, controlled, like none of this had affected me at all. "I am not trying anything," I replied, steady this time, or at least steadier. "I am working," and I gestured vaguely to the desk, to the files, to anything that could anchor the moment back into something ordinary. Lucas watched me for a beat longer than necessary, like he was measuring the distance not just physically but emotionally, like he was deciding whether to push again or let me pretend this was normal. And then he nodded once, small and subtle, but not dismissive, never dismissive. "Right," he said quietly, and something in that single word made my chest tighten again, because it did not sound like agreement. It sounded like patience. The silence that followed was different now, not charged in the same immediate way, but still heavy, still present, like everything we had not said was sitting just beneath the surface, waiting. I turned back to the desk, flipping open one of the folders, scanning lines of text that blurred almost instantly, my focus slipping every few seconds because I could still feel him there, still feel the echo of that almost touch, that almost moment, like it had left a mark that had nothing to do with sight. I forced myself to read, to process, to do something that resembled actual work, but my body was not cooperating, still keyed up, still alert, still reacting like it had not yet caught up to the fact that nothing had actually happened. A chair shifted behind me, the faint scrape of it against the floor sending a small, ridiculous jolt through my system, and I clenched my jaw, annoyed at myself for reacting to something so minor, something so normal. "We have a meeting in 10 minutes, Lucas said, and his tone had shifted back into something more professional, more distant, like he had stepped back into a role I could understand, one that did not involve this undercurrent of something unresolved. I nodded quickly, too quickly. "I know," I said, even though I had not been thinking about it at all, even though the only thing I had been aware of for the past several minutes was him, his presence, the way my body refused to ignore it. I gathered the files, stacking them neatly just to give my hands something to do, something controlled, something precise, and when I finally moved to step past him again, I made sure to leave more space this time. A full step, maybe even two, careful, deliberate, like I was proving a point to both of us. But as I walked by, even without contact, even without a brush of fabric or skin, I felt it again, that subtle pull, that awareness, like my body was still tracking him, still orienting itself around him without permission. And I hated it. I hated how automatic it felt, how instinctive, how familiar. I kept moving, not slowing down, not giving myself a chance to falter, but as I reached the doorway and paused just long enough to adjust my grip on the folders, I felt his gaze on me again, steady and quiet, and I did not have to turn around to know he was watching, did not have to look to feel the weight of it. And that was the problem, because even without touching me, even without saying anything else, he still had this effect on me. And as I stepped out into the hallway, telling myself that distance would fix it, that space would reset everything, I realized with a sinking certainty that no amount of space was going to be enough. The hallway should have felt different, wider, safer, but it did not. It just felt louder, every step echoing too sharply against the polished floor, every breath too noticeable in my chest, like I had carried the tension out of that room with me instead of leaving it behind. I kept walking anyway, steady, controlled, focusing on the rhythm of my steps, on the cool air against my skin, on anything that was not the lingering awareness of him just a few feet behind me, because I could still feel it, that quiet pull, like something unseen was tethering me back to where he stood. I pushed open the conference room door and stepped inside, immediately greeted by the low hum of conversation, chairs shifting, the faint scent of coffee and paper that should have grounded me, should have pulled me back into something normal. But even as I nodded to a coworker and moved toward the table, my senses felt slightly off, like everything was a second delayed, slightly muted compared to the sharp clarity I had just experienced. I set the folders down carefully, aligning them with unnecessary precision, my fingers lingering just a second too long on the edge of the table before I forced myself to pull back, to sit, to breathe. People were talking, someone was laughing softly at the far end, a pen clicked, a laptop snapped open, all the small, ordinary sounds of a meeting starting, and I clung to them, let them wash over me, trying to reset, trying to remind myself that this was real life, not whatever had just happened outside. The door opened again behind me, and I did not have to turn to know it was him. I felt it immediately, that subtle shift in the air, that quiet tightening in my chest, that instant awareness that had nothing to do with sight and everything to do with instinct. I stared straight ahead, forcing my posture to stay relaxed, forcing my breathing to stay even, but my fingers curled slightly against the table anyway, betraying the tension I was trying to hide. Footsteps approached, unhurried, measured, and then the chair beside me moved, just slightly, the soft scrape against the floor sending a small jolt through me, and I clenched my jaw, annoyed, frustrated, because this should not be happening. Not here, not now, not after all this time. He sat down next to me, not too close, not touching, but close enough that I could feel the warmth of him again, subtle but unmistakable, like standing near a heat source you could not quite see but could definitely feel. "You always sit on the left," he said quietly, not looking at me, his voice low enough that no one else would hear, and my breath caught before I could stop it, because of course he remembered that too, of course he noticed something so small, something I had never even thought about until this moment. I shifted slightly in my seat, trying to create more space without making it obvious, without drawing attention. But the movement only made me more aware of how little distance there actually was, how easily it could disappear if either of us moved just an inch closer. "It is just a chair," I replied under my breath, keeping my eyes forward. But the words felt weak, unconvincing, even to me. Lucas did not respond right away, and that silence stretched again, familiar and heavy, until I felt it. Not a touch, not quite, but close. The faintest brush of movement near my arm as he adjusted something on the table, and my entire body reacted instantly. A sharp inhale, a tightening in my chest, my shoulders pulling in before I could stop them. I closed my eyes briefly, just for a second, trying to steady myself, trying to regain control, but it was slipping, faster now, easier, like the longer I stayed near him, the harder it became to separate what I felt now from what I used to feel then. The meeting started, voices rising and falling around us, someone presenting, someone asking questions, but I barely registered any of it. My focus fractured, split between the words I was supposed to hear and the presence beside me that I could not ignore. I kept my gaze fixed on the documents in front of me, pretending to read, pretending to follow along, but every small movement from him pulled at my attention, every shift, every breath, every subtle change in posture, like my body was tracking him automatically, without permission. And as the minutes passed, stretching longer than they should have, I realized something that made my stomach drop, something I had been trying not to see, because it meant everything was worse than I thought, because it meant this was not fading, not settling, not easing into something manageable. It was building, slowly, steadily, and the longer I sat here, pretending everything was fine, the more I could feel myself slipping back into something I had promised I would never return to. The numbers on the screen blurred together after a while, rows and columns that should have made sense, but refused to settle into anything meaningful, because every time I tried to focus, something pulled me back, something quiet and persistent sitting just inches away from me. I shifted in my chair again, subtle, controlled, but it did nothing to ease the tension building under my skin, nothing to quiet the steady rhythm of my heartbeat that felt too loud for a room this quiet. Someone across the table asked a question, their voice cutting through the air, and I forced myself to look up, nodding like I had been paying attention, like I knew exactly what they were talking about. But even as I responded, even as words left my mouth in what sounded like a coherent answer, part of me remained acutely aware of Lucas beside me, of the way his presence seemed to occupy more space than it should. He shifted slightly, just a small movement, adjusting his posture, and my entire body reacted before I could stop it, my shoulders tensing, my breath catching, my attention snapping sideways for a fraction of a second before I forced it back to the front. This was ridiculous. Completely ridiculous, and I hated it. Hated how automatic it was, how instinctive, how impossible it felt to control. I pressed my fingertips against the edge of the table, grounding myself, focusing on the cool surface beneath my skin, on the faint texture of the wood, anything to anchor me back into the present. "Ethan," someone said, and I blinked, realizing too late that they had been calling my name more than once, and I straightened quickly, offering a brief apology, trying to cover the moment with something that looked like composure. A few people chuckled lightly, brushing it off, and I forced a small smile, but it felt strained, thin, like it did not quite reach where it needed to. Beside me, Lucas remained quiet, but I could feel it, the shift in his attention, the way it settled more fully on me, like he had noticed everything, like he always did. "Are you okay?" he asked, low enough that it did not carry beyond us, and I stiffened instantly, the question hitting somewhere deeper than it should have, because it sounded too familiar, too much like something from before, something I had not heard in years. "I am fine," I replied quickly, too quickly, not looking at him, keeping my gaze fixed on the screen ahead, but the words felt hollow even as I said them, like they did not quite hold together under the weight of everything I was trying to ignore. There was a pause, just long enough to make me aware of it, just long enough to make my chest tighten again, and then I felt it, not a full touch, not deliberate, just the faintest brush against my hand as he reached for a pen, something so small it could have been accidental, something that no one else would have noticed, but it hit me like it was anything but my breath caught sharply, my fingers twitching as if they remembered something I had no control over, and I pulled my hand back almost immediately, the movement quick, instinctive, impossible to hide. The pen clicked softly in his hand, the sound oddly loud in the moment, and I kept my eyes forward, refusing to look at him, refusing to acknowledge what had just happened, even as my pulse spiked all over again. "Still nothing," he murmured. So quiet I almost thought I imagined it. But I knew I had not, and something in my chest twisted at the certainty in his voice, at the way he was no longer questioning, only confirming. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to breathe, to steady, to push everything back down where it belonged, because this was not happening. This could not be happening, not in the middle of a meeting, not in a room full of people, not after everything I had done to move on, but as I sat there, hands still, posture controlled, expression carefully neutral. I could feel it anyway, that slow, steady unraveling, like something inside me was coming undone thread by thread, and no matter how tightly I tried to hold it together, it was slipping through my fingers all over again. The meeting should have ended sooner. It should have wrapped up neatly like every other meeting, but time stretched in a way that felt deliberate, like the room itself was holding me there just long enough for everything inside me to unravel a little more. I kept my posture straight, my expression neutral, nodding at the right moments, responding when necessary, but it all felt distant, like I was operating on instinct while something else entirely took over beneath the surface. Beside me, Lucas remained still for a while, quiet, almost too quiet, and that silence pressed in just as much as his presence had before, because I knew he was watching. I could feel it, the weight of his attention settling over me in a way that was impossible to ignore. I shifted again, small, controlled, trying to ease the tension building along my shoulders, trying to create even a fraction more space between us, but the chair legs barely moved an inch before stopping, and the minimal distance did nothing, absolutely nothing, to dull the awareness that had taken hold of me. Someone laughed across the table, a light, easy sound that did not belong in the tight, fragile atmosphere that seemed to exist only around me, and I forced myself to focus on that, on the normalcy of it, on the idea that this was just another workday, just another meeting, just another moment that would pass if I could just hold myself together long enough. Lucas moved again, slow, deliberate, and this time I did not need to look to know what he was doing. I felt it in the subtle shift of air, in the slight change in the space beside me, like the room itself adjusted to accommodate him. "You are still counting," he said quietly, his voice low enough that it blended into the background noise, but close enough that it landed exactly where he intended, and my breath stuttered before I could stop it, because he was right, because I had been counting without realizing it, seconds between movements, distance between us, anything to give myself a sense of control. "I am not," I replied under my breath, but the denial came out weaker than I wanted, thinner, like it did not fully belong to me. Lucas let out a slow breath, not quite a sigh, not quite anything I could name. And then he shifted closer, just a fraction, not enough to draw attention, not enough to be obvious, but enough, more than enough, because my entire body reacted instantly, my shoulders tightening, my pulse jumping, my focus snapping sideways again before I forced it back forward. "You always did that," he continued, voice even softer now, like he was speaking directly into the space between us. "When you were trying not to feel something." And that hit deeper than anything else he had said so far, because it was not about the present, it was about before, about patterns I thought I had broken, about habits I thought I had outgrown. I swallowed hard, my throat tight, my fingers pressing harder against the table as if I could anchor myself there, as if I could stop whatever this was from pulling me under. "Stop," I said quietly, barely audible, because I did not trust my voice to hold if I pushed it any louder, did not trust myself to keep everything contained if I gave it too much space. There was a brief pause, and for a second I thought he might actually listen, might step back, might let this settle into something manageable, but then I felt it, unmistakable this time, the lightest brush of his sleeve against mine as he reached forward again, deliberate now, not accidental, not subtle, just enough to test, just enough to confirm. My breath caught sharply, my entire body going still in a way that felt almost involuntary, like everything in me had locked into place at once, and I hated it, hated how immediate it was, how undeniable, how impossible it felt to control. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, trying to steady myself, trying to push past it, but the sensation lingered, warm and familiar, like something I had known too well once and never truly forgot. Still nothing. He murmured again, softer this time, almost thoughtful, and I clenched my jaw, forcing myself not to react, not to give him anything else, not to let him see just how much this was affecting me. But as the meeting continued, around us, voices rising and falling in a rhythm I could not quite follow, I realized that no matter how still I stayed, no matter how controlled I appeared, he had already seen everything that mattered, and the more he tested, the more he proved it, the harder it became to pretend that this was something I could ignore, because it was not fading, it was not weakening, it was growing, steady, and relentless. And I was running out of ways to hide it the moment the meeting ended. Chairs shifted, back all at once, conversations rising in overlapping layers, papers gathered, laptops snapped shut, and the sudden noise should have broken whatever hold that tension had on me. But it did not. It only made it harder to breathe, harder to think, because now I had to move, had to stand, had to pass him again, and the idea alone made something tighten low in my chest. I pushed my chair back slowly, deliberately, giving myself a second longer than necessary, pretending to organize my notes, to align the edges of the folders, to create a delay that felt like control even though it was nothing of the sort. People began filing out, casual, relaxed, unaware, and I let them pass first, one after another, until the space around me cleared just enough to make leaving unavoidable. I stood, finally, steady on the outside, unstable somewhere deeper, and reached for the stack of files, my fingers brushing the paper, grounding myself for a brief second before I turned. Lucas was already standing, closer than I expected, not blocking my way, not forcing anything, just there, positioned in a way that made the space between us feel intentional again, measured. "After you," he said, his tone neutral, professional, but there was something underneath it, something quieter, something that made my pulse spike before I even moved. I hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, and that was enough for him to notice, enough for him to confirm whatever he had been testing all this time. I stepped forward anyway, keeping my movements controlled, careful, leaving as much space as the room allowed. But as I passed him, the distance narrowed on its own, the edge of my sleeve brushing lightly against his wrist, and my breath caught instantly, sharp and involuntary, like my body had been waiting for that exact moment. I kept walking, forcing myself not to react, not to slow down, but the sensation lingered, warm and familiar, trailing after me like something I could not quite shake. The hallway outside was quieter now, the earlier noise fading into something softer, more distant, and I told myself this was better, that this was what I needed. Space, distance, separation, but even as I moved farther away, I could still feel him behind me. That same awareness, that same pull, like it did not rely on proximity anymore, like it had already settled somewhere deeper. "Ethan," he said, and I stopped before I could stop myself, the sound of my name hitting something automatic, something instinctive, and I closed my eyes briefly, annoyed at my own reaction before I turned around. He was only a few steps away, not rushing, not crowding, just standing there with that same steady gaze, that same quiet certainty that made it impossible to pretend this was nothing. "What?" I asked, sharper than I intended, the word cutting through the space between us, but it did not feel strong. It felt thin, like it was trying to cover something it could not quite contain. Lucas did not answer right away, and that pause stretched, familiar and heavy, until I felt it again. That shift, that subtle step closer, not enough to invade, not enough to cross a clear line, but enough, always enough. "You said it does not mean anything," he said finally, his voice low, measured, like he was laying something out piece by piece, and my chest tightened because I knew where this was going, because I had been trying to avoid it from the moment I saw him again. "It does not," I replied quickly, too quickly, stepping back just slightly, creating space that felt necessary even if it was minimal. His gaze flickered briefly to that movement, noting it, storing it, and then returned to my face, steady as ever. "Then stop reacting," he said, not harsh, not demanding, just simple, direct, And that hit harder than anything else, because it was not something I could argue with, not something I could deflect, not something I could explain away. I opened my mouth, ready to respond, ready to deny it again, to push back, to reclaim some sense of control, but nothing came out. Because the truth was already there, sitting between us, undeniable and exposed. And the more I tried to fight it, the clearer it became. Lucas took one more step, slow, deliberate, closing the gap just enough to make my breath hitch again, just enough to prove his point without saying another word. And I hated it. Hated how easy it was for him, how impossible it was for me. See, he murmured, softer now, almost quiet enough to miss. But I heard it. Of course I did. And as I stood there, frozen for just a second too long, caught between stepping back and staying exactly where I was, I realized that this was no longer something I could ignore, no longer something I could pretend was fading, because every second I spent near him only made it clearer, stronger, harder to deny. And for the first time since he walked back into my life, I felt something shift, not just in my body, but in the fragile control I had been clinging to, because it was starting to slip, and I was no longer sure I could hold on for a second. Neither of us moved. The space between us stretched thin, fragile, like it was holding something that could break if either of us breathed wrong. And I realized I was holding my breath again, exactly like he said, exactly like I used to. And the worst part was I had not even noticed until now. I exhaled slowly, forcing air back into my lungs, forcing my shoulders to drop, forcing myself to step back. One full step this time, creating real distance instead of the illusion of it. And I latched onto that space like it meant something, like it could fix this if I just held on to it long enough. This is pointless, I said, my voice steadier now, sharper, because I needed it to be, needed something to push back against the way everything inside me kept leaning forward instead. You are reading too much into nothing. And I held his gaze, refusing to look away this time, refusing to let him see anything else. Lucas watched me quietly, his expression unreadable for a moment, and then something shifted, subtle but unmistakable, like he had made a decision, like he was done testing and ready to say what he had been circling around this entire time. If it is nothing, he said, calm, measured, then it should be easy for you to prove it. And my chest tightened again, because I knew exactly what he meant before he even moved. He stepped closer, slow, deliberate, giving me time to react, time to step away, time to refuse. And I should have taken that chance, should have created distance again, should have shut this down before it went any further. But I did not move. I just stood there, frozen in place for 1 second too long. He stopped right in front of me, not touching, not quite, but close enough that I could feel the warmth of him again, that same steady presence that made everything else fade into the background, and my pulse jumped immediately, betraying me. All over again. Look at me, he said quietly, and I already was. But something in his tone made it feel different, heavier, like this moment mattered more than the others, like this was where everything shifted. I swallowed, my throat tight, my focus narrowing in a way that felt almost dangerous, like I was stepping into something I had been trying to avoid since the moment he walked back into my life. Do not move, he added, softer now, not a command, not quite, but something close enough that my body responded anyway, stilling completely, like it remembered what that tone meant before my mind could argue with it. He lifted his hand slowly, not sudden, not forceful, just enough to give me time to pull away, to stop this, to prove him wrong like I had been trying to do all day. But I did not move. I did not step back. I did not stop him. And that was the problem. Because the moment his fingers brushed lightly against my sleeve, barely there, barely contact, my breath caught again. Sharp and immediate, my shoulders tensing, my entire body reacting like it had been waiting for that exact point of contact. It was nothing. It was barely anything. Fabric against fabric, skin not even fully touching. And yet it felt like everything. Like something had been unlocked with the smallest possible movement. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, trying to steady myself, trying to control the reaction, trying to force it down, but it was already there, already too obvious, already impossible to hide. Lucas's hand stilled, just for a second, like he was confirming it, like he was feeling the exact moment my body gave me away, and when I opened my eyes again, his gaze was fixed on me, steady, certain, no doubt left in it at all. That is not nothing, he said quietly, and I had no answer for that. No argument, no denial that could hold against what had just happened, because we both felt it, we both saw it, and standing there with that realization settling between us, I understood something I had been trying not to admit, something I had been avoiding since the very beginning, because it meant everything was about to get harder, because it meant this was not going away, not fading, not something I could ignore, because my body had already chosen, and I was the only one still pretending I had a say in it. The air between us did not move after that. It held, thick and quiet, like the moment had stretched past something normal into something that could not be undone, and I could feel it settling into me. That realization, heavy and unavoidable. I forced myself to take a step back, this time not subtle, not careful, just enough to break the space between us in a way that felt final, or at least I wanted it to feel that way. Even if my pulse had not slowed, even if my chest still felt tight like I had been holding something in for too long. That does not prove anything, I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected, sharper, like I was clinging to logic as the only thing that still made sense. It is just a reaction, nothing more. And I held his gaze, refusing to look away, refusing to let him see the way my hands had started to feel unsteady again. Lucas did not argue immediately, and that silence was worse than if he had, because it gave the words space to hang there, to be examined, to fall apart on their own. He lowered his hand slowly, not retreating, not distancing himself, just removing the point of contact like it had already done its job, and his eyes stayed on mine, steady, patient, like he was waiting for me to hear how weak my own argument sounded. A reaction to what? He asked finally, quiet, not pressing, not accusing, just asking in a way that made it impossible to ignore, and my chest tightened because I did not have an answer that would hold, not one that would explain this without unraveling everything else along with it. I looked away for a second, just a second, letting my gaze fall to the floor between us, to the clean line of the hallway tiles. Anything to avoid the way his expression seemed to cut straight through whatever defense I tried to build. It does not matter, I said, softer now, the edge slipping despite my effort to keep it. Whatever it is, it does not change anything. And that was the part one needed to believe, the part one had built everything on. The idea that the past stayed where it belonged, that distance meant something, that time had done its job. Lucas took a slow breath, like he was considering that, like he was giving me the space to hold on to that illusion if I wanted to. And for a second I thought he might step back and let this settle into something manageable, something I could contain. But then he moved again, not closer this time, not testing, just shifting slightly so that he was no longer directly in front of me but still close enough that I could not ignore him, still present in a way that felt intentional. It changes something, he said, and his voice was different now, quieter, but firmer, like he was no longer trying to prove anything, just stating what he already knew. Because you are still reacting to me. And the way he said it, simple, certain, made something in my chest twist again, because there was no room left to deny it, not after everything that had just happened. I exhaled slowly, the breath leaving me heavier than it should have, and I shook my head once, more to myself than to him, like I could physically push the thought away if I tried hard enough. That does not mean I want anything, I said, and this time the words felt closer to the truth, closer to something I could hold on to, because wanting was different. Wanting was a choice, something I could control, something I could refuse. Lucas watched me for a moment, his expression unreadable again, but there was something there, something quieter, something that made my pulse shift in a way I did not quite understand. I did not say you did, he replied, just as calm, just as steady, and that caught me off guard more than anything else he had said so far, because I had been bracing for something else, something sharper, something that would push this further than I was ready to go. The silence that followed was different, less tense, but no less heavy, like we had crossed into something new, something neither of us had fully named yet. I tightened my grip on the folders still in my hands, grounding myself again, reminding myself where I was, what this was supposed to be, what I needed it to stay, and I took another step back, creating space that felt more solid this time, more deliberate. We should get back to work, I said finally, my voice more controlled now, more even. like I had managed to gather some of the pieces back together, at least on the surface. Lucas did not move to stop me, did not step forward again, and that should have felt like relief, should have made this easier. But as I turned away and started walking down the hallway, I could still feel it, that awareness, that quiet pull that had not gone anywhere, and I realized with a slow, sinking certainty that even if I could convince myself I did not want anything, even if I could hold on to that line, it did not change the fact that something in me was still responding, still remembering, still reacting in ways I could not control, and that was going to matter, whether I admitted it or not. I should have walked faster, should have put more distance between us, should have let the hallway swallow that moment whole, but my steps slowed without permission, just slightly, just enough to feel the weight of it trailing behind me like something unfinished. The office around me had returned to normal, phones ringing softly, keyboards clicking, low conversations weaving through the space, everything exactly as it should be, and yet none of it settled into me the way it used to, like something fundamental had shifted and I had not caught up yet. I reached my desk and set the folders down with careful precision, aligning them again, fingers pressing a little too firmly against the edges, grounding myself in something controlled, something predictable, because nothing about the past few minutes had been either. I exhaled slowly, rolling my shoulders back, forcing tension out of my body piece by piece, telling myself it was over, that the moment had passed, that I could reset if I just focused, if I just stayed here, in this space, away from him. But the thought barely settled before I felt it. Again, that quiet awareness, that subtle shift in the air that told me he had followed, not close, not immediately, but enough that my body registered it before I even turned. I did not look up right away. I kept my eyes on the documents in front of me, flipping one open, scanning lines that blurred together, pretending to read, pretending to work, pretending everything was exactly as it had been before. But my focus slipped almost instantly, my attention pulling sideways again, towards something I refused to acknowledge. Footsteps stopped near my desk, not too close, not crowding, just there, measured, deliberate, and I clenched my jaw slightly, steadying myself before I finally looked up. Lucas stood across from me, not leaning, not reaching, just watching, and there was something different in his expression now, something quieter, less testing, more certain, like he had already reached a conclusion and was deciding what to do with it. "You are avoiding me," he said, simple, direct, and I almost laughed, because it sounded obvious, because it was obvious, but also because it was not that simple, not anymore. "I am working," I replied, echoing what I had said before, but it sounded weaker this time, thinner, like the repetition made it less believable instead of more. Lucas glanced briefly at the open folder in front of me, then back at my face, and the slight shift in his gaze made my chest tighten again, because it felt like he could see right through it, through me, through everything I was trying to hold together. "You are not even reading that," he said quietly, and I looked down instinctively, realizing he was right, the page in front of me unchanged, untouched, my eyes having moved over it without processing a single word. I exhaled through my nose, frustration building, not just at him, but at myself, at the way this entire situation had slipped out of my control so easily. "What do you want?" I asked, sharper now, because I needed something to push against, something to define this instead of letting it linger in that uncertain space. Lucas did not answer immediately, and that pause stretched again, familiar, heavy, but different this time, less about testing and more about choosing. "I want you to stop pretending this is nothing," he said finally, his voice still calm, still even, but there was something under it now, something firmer, something that did not leave room for easy deflection. My chest tightened, the words landing deeper than I wanted them to, because they hit something I had been trying not to see, something I had been avoiding since the moment he walked back into my life. "It is nothing," I insisted, but the denial felt weaker now, thinner, like it was starting to crack under its own weight. Lucas's gaze did not waver. If anything, it steadied further, like he was anchoring himself in that certainty, and that made something in me falter, just slightly, just enough to feel the shift. "Then look at me and say that without reacting," he said, quiet, controlled, but unmistakably direct, and my breath caught again, because I knew what he was asking, knew what he was pointing out, knew exactly how difficult that would be. I held his gaze, forcing myself to stay still, to keep my breathing even, to keep my body from betraying me again, and for a second, just 1 second, I thought I might manage it, thought I might finally prove him wrong. But then he took a small step closer, not sudden, not forceful, just enough to narrow the space between us again, just enough to bring that familiar warmth back into reach, and my chest tightened instantly, my breath hitching before I could stop it, my fingers curling slightly against the edge of the desk. I closed my eyes briefly, frustration and something else twisting together in my chest, because I had actually tried, and it still was not enough. And when I opened them again and met his gaze, steady and knowing and entirely too certain, I realized that no matter how much I resisted, no matter how hard I pushed back, I was losing this in a way that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with the part of me that still responded to him without permission for a moment. Everything went quiet again, not the room, not the office, but inside me, like something had finally hit a point where it could not keep pretending, could not keep bending around the truth I had been avoiding. I stayed still, forcing my hands to relax against the desk, forcing my breathing to slow even though it felt uneven, like it was catching on something I could not quite push past. Lucas did not move either, and that stillness between us felt different now, heavier, like the tension had shifted into something more solid, something that could not be brushed off or ignored anymore. "Say it," he said quietly, not demanding, not raising his voice, but there was something in it that made it impossible to dismiss, something that held the space between us in place. I swallowed, my throat tight, and met his gaze, really met it this time without looking away, without trying to escape into something else, and for a second, just a second, everything felt too clear, too sharp, like I was seeing everything at once without any way to soften it. "It is nothing," I said again, but the words came out slower this time, heavier, like they had to push through something to be said at all, and I felt it immediately, the way my chest tightened, the way my breath hitched just slightly at the end, the way my body reacted even as I tried to hold it steady. Lucas watched me closely, not interrupting, not correcting, just letting the moment sit there, and that made it worse, because there was no argument to hide behind, no distraction to pull me away from what had just happened. "You hesitated," he said after a second, his voice softer now, almost careful, like he was not trying to win anymore, just trying to make me see it. I shook my head quickly, too quickly, the movement sharper than I intended, because I needed to push back against that, needed to hold on to something solid before everything slipped further. "That does not mean anything," I said, but the words felt thinner now, like they were losing weight every time I repeated them, like they were starting to fall apart under their own repetition. Lucas exhaled slowly, his gaze dropping for a brief moment before returning to mine, and that small shift did something unexpected, something that made my chest tighten in a different way, because it felt less like pressure and more like understanding, and I was not sure which one I hated more. "You do not have to decide anything right now," he said, quieter now, the edge gone completely, replaced with something steadier, something that did not push but did not retreat either. "But do not lie to yourself about what is happening." And that hit harder than anything else he had said, because it was not about him anymore, not about what he thought or what he wanted. It was about me, about the way I had been trying to rewrite something that my body kept correcting. I looked away again, just for a second, my gaze dropping to the desk, to the faint reflection of light on the surface, anything to avoid the way his words settled into me, because they did not bounce off. They stayed, sinking in deeper than I wanted them to. "I am not lying," I said, but it sounded quieter now, less certain, like I was saying it more to convince myself than him. Lucas did not argue, did not push, and that silence stretched again, but this time it did not feel like pressure. It felt like space, like he was giving me room to sit with it, to process it, to either hold on to the denial or let it slip. I took a slow breath, then another, trying to steady myself, trying to regain something that felt like control, but it was different now, not as sharp, not as clear, like something had shifted in a way I could not undo. I meant what I said. I added, softer now, not looking at him, because I was not sure I could hold that line if I did. "I do not want anything," and that part still felt true, still felt like something I could hold on to, something I could define. Lucas nodded once, small, almost imperceptible, like he accepted that, like he understood it. And that should have made things easier, should have settled something. But instead it left a different kind of weight in its place, something quieter but no less present. That does not change the fact that something is still there, he said gently. Not pushing, not insisting, just stating it. And I closed my eyes for a brief second, because I knew he was right. Even if I did not want to admit it, even if I was not ready to face what that meant. When I opened them again, the room felt the same, the office still moving around us, normal, unchanged, but something between us had shifted in a way that would not go back. And as I stood there, caught between what I wanted to believe and what I could no longer ignore, I realized that this was no longer about proving him wrong. It was about figuring out what I was going to do now that I could not pretend this was nothing anymore. The silence between us did not break. Right away, it settled, deep and steady, like something had finally stopped fighting and simply existed. And I stood there, feeling it, aware of it in a way I could no longer ignore, because there was no easy way to step back from this now. No simple way to return to what things were before he walked back into my life. I drew in a slow breath, letting it fill my chest, letting it ground me just enough to think clearly. Because for the first time since this started, it was not just about reacting. It was about deciding what came next, and that felt heavier than anything else. I looked at him again, really looked this time, not just at the space between us or the way he stood too close or too steady, but at him, at the familiarity that had not faded as much as I wanted it to, at the quiet certainty in his expression that I used to understand without needing words. You always do this, I said quietly, the words coming out before I could stop them, softer than anything I had said. So far, less defensive, more honest than I intended, and his gaze shifted just slightly, attentive, focused, like he recognized the change immediately. Do what? He asked, not pressing, just asking, and I exhaled, a small breath that carried more weight than it should have. You make it sound simple, I said, my voice steady but quieter now, like I was speaking more to the space between us than anything else. Like it is just something I have to admit, and that fixes everything. And I shook my head slightly, because it was not that simple. It had never been that simple. Lucas watched me, listening this time, not interrupting, not stepping closer, just letting me say it. And that made it easier and harder at the same time. It does not fix anything, he said after a moment, calm, even, but ignoring it does not either. And I knew that. I had known that from the moment this started. I just had not wanted to face it. I looked away briefly, my gaze falling to the edge of my desk, to the familiar lines and objects that had always been enough to ground me before, but they felt different now, less solid, like something else had taken priority without asking. I meant what I said. I added, quieter now, because that part still mattered, still needed to be said out loud. I do not want anything. And this time I did look back at him, held his gaze, because I needed him to understand that, needed that boundary to exist even if everything else was uncertain. Lucas nodded once, again, that same small acknowledgement, and there was no argument in it, no push, just acceptance of what I was saying without dismissing everything else. Then we start there, he said, simple, steady, and something about that shifted the weight slightly, not gone, not resolved, but different, like it had been acknowledged instead of fought. I let out a slow breath, some of the tension easing just enough to feel it, just enough to realize how tightly I had been holding everything together before. The office around us continued, unchanged, people moving, voices rising and falling. The normal rhythm of a day that did not care about whatever had just shifted between us. And for the first time since this began, I felt like I could stand in that space without immediately losing my footing. I adjusted the folders on my desk, small, habitual, something familiar to anchor myself. And when I looked back up, Lucas had stepped back slightly, not far, but enough to give space that felt intentional, respectful, not forced. It was different now, not the same tension, not the same immediate pull, but not gone either, just quieter, steadier, like something that had settled. Instead of disappeared. We still have work to do, I said, more evenly now, more controlled, and it sounded closer to normal, closer to something I could maintain. Lucas gave a faint nod, turning slightly, the moment easing without breaking completely, and as he moved away, not far, just enough, I felt it again, that awareness, that subtle pull. But it was different this time, less overwhelming, more something I could recognize instead of something that controlled me. And as I turned back to my desk, to the files, to the work that still needed to be done, I realized that this was not over, not resolved, not something that would disappear just because I wanted it to, but for the first time, it did not feel like something I had to run from. It felt like something I would have to face, step by step, whether I was ready or not. Because no matter how much I tried to forget, some part of me had never really let go, and now that it was awake again, there was no pretending it did not exist.